and welcome to the Dial Global Virtual Lounge, the show where we discuss the future of the modern workplace and the impact of diversity, inclusion and belonging with the world's most successful and innovative business leaders. Today we have a phenomenal panel for you and are joined by Pierre Le Manh, CEO for North America, Ipsos, and Global Deputy CEO for Ipsos, Helen Kennett, the Director for Government Relations at Rolls-Royce, and David Grevemberg, the CEO of the Commonwealth Games Federation. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for being here. And I wondered, just before we kickstart and get into some of the nuts and bolts for today, whether we could just do a brief round robin for our listeners and for those who are tuning in on demand, a little bit about some of the current pieces you are experiencing given these unprecedented times, and also a little into a background of what you're doing. David, I'm going to start with you if that's okay, because I do like to pick on you. So I'm going to come to you first, and we will go round before getting into the subject matter.
Well, I think it's unprecedented the amount of times I'm using the word unprecedented. It's been quite interesting over the past I'd say six weeks to see how the global sports industry has, I think, fundamentally changed forever. Both, I think, in terms of how we perceive our roles in society, to the fragility of some of our, I guess, systems, structures that have been in place for quite a long time, to the future viability and relevance of some of our properties. And it's really forcing us to look at ourselves, how we work very differently, and dare I say, probably work differently together in a way that's going to, I think, ultimately have fundamental change in terms of what is recoverable, but also what will emerge as really a reset to, I think, a new future of sport and what that will look like. I think how we consume sport, how we manage sport, and ultimately how we potentially could enjoy sport. So, and that's having a knock-on effect in terms of people. In terms of being people-centered. Sport doesn't happen without people. Sport is not enjoyed without people. So all of that is really pushing us to the brink of our, I think our creativity, but also in some cases our current capacity, and that's both challenging but also exciting at the same time.
Thank you for sharing your insight, David. And Helen.
Hi, yes. My name is Helen Kennett. I'm in charge of UK government relations at Rolls-Royce, and that's Rolls-Royce, the power systems group, not Rolls-Royce, the automotive manufacturer, because we do something much more exciting, much more sexy than that. So we are the company that makes power systems that make things fly. Now, at the moment, that's being very challenged. So 51% of our business comes from our civil aerospace function. And at the moment, as we've seen a massive drop in flying hours, then that's obviously having a pretty existential threat to the rest of the group. So where we are at the moment is we've been trying to understand exactly what that means in terms of what our passengers are doing, and also what our airframer customers, so Airbus and Boeing, what their demand signal is going to look like and what that's going to mean for the group. So this has been a major part of the work that I've been doing over the last 6-7 weeks, is trying to understand what that means politically and how we're going to have to try to shape our future strategy to be able to meet the new landscape that we're all in. And what that might mean, I don't think anybody really knows at the moment. I know we're obviously going to be talking about leading later on, but I've always heard at Rolls-Royce, and this is absolutely the case, is that being a good leader is about dealing with ambiguity. There's a phenomenal amount of ambiguity at the moment. And one of the things is, how do we as leaders try to demonstrate that there is a clear plan when there are so many fluid moving issues that we just really can't fully get our arms around at the moment. So thank you for your time today. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Helen. And finally, Pierre.
I think for us, if I try to remember when this all started, and between January and February, we knew that the situation in China was bad. And I think for a while, like everybody else, we were sort of hopeful that one way or another we would get away with this without, without being really hit. We were thinking of previous pandemics, frankly, where so much had been said and so little had actually happened to, at least to the Western world, right? Remember the mad cow, remember the SARS, Ebola, the H1N1, all these pandemics previously seemed to be very scary, but never became as bad as we feared at one point. So I think we're all in that kind of denial phase until the end of February. This is when things started to shift, I think. And, and then I don't know if one day we'll probably write about that, the speed at which things changed day after day. I remember on March 1st, we banned any international travel. I had an emergency call with my teams and they were all freaking out saying, how are we going to explain this to our clients? We won't be able to go with them, do research outside of the US. This is going to be terrible. What is the script? What are we going to tell clients? And I was telling them, talk to them about security and, don't worry, soon it's going to be the same for them. And actually 2 days later, it was already a topic behind us. And then I think the next stage has been for us, okay, are we going to shut down our offices? Are we going to anticipate measures taken by the government? And one night we decided to send everybody home overnight like this, no test. We just tried it. And now we discovered that it's actually easy, at least for a business like our business, working from home is not particularly difficult. And then we started to help clients understand people, societies, markets, which is what we do. And even now, when we're talking about reopening, many leaders believe that the damage done to the economy is way worse than the damage done to people's health, right? And so we need to reopen. But then when you ask even Americans, do you think we should reopen before the virus is contained? 2/3 of them say no. To a large proportion of Americans do not want to go back to work like this, without any form of security. So things are evolving. And even now we're at this phase where we're starting to come to terms with the fact that things are very slow to come back. Initially when we shut everything down, we thought, okay, this is going to be terrible, but then there will be a massive rebound. Like everybody was talking about the rebound. How can we be ready for the rebound? Now we understand that this rebound is it's going to be very slow. So every single day we have to adjust to the reality of the situation. Today, the markets are reacting to the financial performance of Amazon, right? And they realize that even if your top line grows, maybe your costs are growing as well, and your bottom line is going to be affected. So every single day, we're progressively coming to terms with something that is indeed, David, unprecedented, even if this is the catchword. It's unbelievable.
Thank you very much indeed for sharing, all of you. And Pierre, it's very interesting. So I actually read that piece of insight that Ipsos Mori had put out. And
just for the record, Ipsos Mori is our name in the UK because 12 years ago we acquired a company called Mori and it was very prominent. So we merged it into Ipsos Mori, but elsewhere worldwide we're Ipsos.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and it makes sense because everyone knows Mori in the UK for the polls and such, don't they? So I can see the rationale behind that. But yeah, I mean, it was very, very interesting, and I thought to myself, do I want to go back to how things are going to be? And as you've all alluded to and said, it is just moving so incredibly quickly. An issue of today is most certainly not going to be the issue necessarily of next week. And so whilst people were desperately planning almost the exit strategy, what's it going to be like when it goes back to normal, I think we have now finally come to the stark realization that whilst we don't know whether it will be a V or an L-shaped recovery necessarily. It's going to be staggered. It's going to be in stages. And again, what that looks like, I don't know. Very different also across the various industries. And, I wondered from all of your perspectives, obviously we've got a really fascinating insight across lots of different industries, across a lot of different geographies of which you all do work across. I wondered what your observations were to date when it comes to not only the industry sectors, the relationship and what you're seeing between public and private sectors, but also, the changes that are happening across your various different territories.
Yeah, so I think in some ways it's quite interesting to look at the commonalities and then to look at the differences. And I think that the commonality here especially as I work in government relations, is the central role of governments in this crisis. So regardless of how much an organisation might like to think of itself as being a private sector company and the fact that it can stand on its own 2 feet, at the point at which there is an existential crisis, it's a bit like going to the bank of mum and dad. You know, it's the only point of certainty in the world is governments and the deep pockets that they've got, or the access to the debt markets that they uniquely have. So that's actually a common factor that we've seen across all of the territories in which we operate, is the amount of support that governments are giving to the private sector. And that, I think, is quite interesting for companies who aren't used to dealing with governments and so therefore don't know how to respond or to react to this. For a company like us who do lots of work with the government because the government's a massive customer, we've got very deep and wide relationships, that is not an unusual thing. But I think for others, it's been a very steep learning curve, I think, especially for their leadership, who have probably felt as if they've never needed to do that before. So I think that there's a commonality in terms of everybody looks to the governments for stability, but actually how the leaders deal with that is probably a little bit different. I think the other thing that I'd say is that probably in the long term, it is going to change the business and government and people relationship. I think that what we're seeing as we get deeper into this crisis is the need for leaders to understand that in order to be able to get that support, that they're going to maybe have to trade a little bit of the business independence that they previously liked and loved. That is going to be the reality of all of this. And I think it's quite interesting if you look at this in the long term, in terms of what is going to happen around the blurring of the public and the private sectors. So I think that if you look at the move, especially in the UK, around the privatizations that came through in the 80s and in the early 90s, that then seemed to draw a line in between where the public and the private sector stood. At these times of crisis, where that's blurred again, what does that mean for the future shape of the economy? Is there going to be a greater appetite for the government to step in? Also, the sorts of figures that the UK government and other governments have been putting in to help industry and society in general are eye-wateringly large. So actually, is that going to make them more interested in actually investing a lot of money in businesses? Because, hey, they've already invested hundreds of billions, so they're going to invest some more. So what does that mean for us as leaders? Is that something that we think, well, here's a great opportunity in terms of an economic stimulus, or is that something that you don't want to do because you don't want to be seen to be adding to that general debt burden? So I think it's really interesting in terms of how this is all going to develop in the long term. But the common fact is everybody's going through the same thing, and the responses have actually been broadly pretty much the same globally. That's my perception.
That is fascinating. That is fascinating. Now, I have to say, I think that as a nation in the UK in general, our government has been pretty good. And in comparison to some governments that perhaps have not supported quite as much, shall we say, but most definitely, and of course, in the field of the government relations and such, it's almost.
You want me to share some data on that, Leila?
That would be fascinating.
All right, let me show you something. This is the perceived performance of governments across the globe. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
See, so sorry, because I presented this to the French government yesterday, so that's why I compared with the US government. But see, the performance of governments, this is the question to how do you think the government has performed to contain the spread of the virus? So the question is not so much about the economy here, it's more about the performance in terms of healthcare policies. And you see massive differences. Look at Germany, how from one wave, so this is 2 months ago, then March 19 to 21, April 9 to 12, and then until this week, right? We're still seeing big differences, right? So even if all governments have, of course, been very central, front and central, differences are massive. Just one comment, by the way, Helen, on the role of the government. In the US, what you see is that there is no such thing as a central government, the same way we see that in Europe or even more in some Asian countries. What is incredibly disturbing, in fact, is to see how much it's unclear who makes which decisions. The federal government and the state governments actually fight about who is supposed to make the decisions. I don't know if you've seen that debate, but Trump was saying, if I want, I can decide, but I won't decide. And the states say, well, anyway, you could not decide if you wanted to decide. And so that's the whole discussion. And in fact, it's true. And even the states depend on cities, depends on counties. The counties between the sheriff and the chief executive, they may disagree. And that's how the level of compliance in the US has been pretty bad. And unfortunately, you've seen the consequence.
I think that that's a really good point. The fragility. One of Helen's points, and those stats are very interesting. It'd be interesting to put New Zealand right next to that.
I'd be happy to.
In terms of perception, obviously the outlier. What's quite
well, the government in New Zealand is very popular, as we all know, right? Since the events and the leadership style. Talk about the leadership style that has been extremely modern.
The level of empathy.
Absolutely.
It's comparing this. Many people try to compare this to war, and I said yes, with mass mobilization, but this is a very different type of, I would say, dynamic and situation, which really, if managed appropriately, can be quite unifying in terms of the common threat and common reality that everyone's facing. And I think, dare I say, and I know this has been discussed a lot, is that, we talk about, systems and traditionally patriarchal systems. Well, I say the United States has a very patriarchal traditional system, and it is very diluted. And coming from the States, I've been living overseas for the past 21 years. Looking from the outside in, I certainly see this as, a day of reckoning almost, in terms of the fragility and vulnerability of how the U.S. not only socializes but conducts its business. And I think, ultimately we'll have to do some soul searching. I think one of the points that Helen made, and I completely agree, I certainly see this in the sports industry and a number of the ancillary industries that we work with in terms of entertainment and obviously public health and so forth, is that this working together of public, private, and third sector. I think this will continue to evolve in a much more integrated fashion. I have found it quite remarkable to see many businesses, including public sector components, whether those are quango arm's length bodies or private businesses or even NGO and third sector businesses, the debate around the duty of care. And I find this something that I think people are starting to understand, this notion that respecting and protecting people is paramount before you really start to even talk about profit and politics and promotion and empowerment of anything. If you're not exercising your duty of care, first and foremost, you've failed before you've begun. And I think this is a consistent theme I see coming out in a lot of discourse, a lot of dialogue between C-suite leaders, that, gosh, this is really stressing us out because our priority has been over here, and now it has to be over here before we can go back over here. And that's something I think is going to hopefully evolve, that these soft actually are hard skills. These are some of the things that really help us to be resilient. I think it's going to question culture. I think hierarchical cultures versus market cultures versus clan cultures versus, and this will be the second time I've heard this, or third time, adhocracy cultures. How innovation and risk-taking and much more agile matrix management cultures will evolve. I think the adhocracy culture in a remote working environment actually works quite well in terms of, versus I'm on the top floor and you have to come and visit me to get a decision. This forces executives to be much more accessible on the ground and work more on I think really what matters around mobilizing people during a crisis to still think forward and not just manage a crisis, but also innovate for the future. And I think by upholding your duty of care, you really have the ability to be resilient as much as you can. Now, we are 6 weeks in here in the UK. Talk to me in another 6 weeks, the perspectives may change if we're still in the same situation. So I think even our own view of short, medium, and long-term prioritization and outlooks have fundamentally changed, and it's almost that, I don't want to say daily survival, but it is certainly, I think, our perspectives of that type of urgency, but also patience is really being tested. This environment of the unknown. And I hear a lot of that coming from all sectors that I work with. And we work with public, private, third sector, and many governments, diverse governments, from small state, island states, and vulnerable states to some of our larger economies, such as India, Nigeria, Canada, and so forth, are all experiencing, some of these common themes.
Some fascinating insight there, and perspectives from all of you. And to your point there, David, on duty of care, I think not only does that apply to wider societies and of course our direct teams, but also leaders who are in positions such as yourselves. I think, often this is something that I hear slightly less about actually in the press of the current moment, is we are worrying, quite rightly so, about everyone else within our families and within the current environment, and almost as leaders being seen as these pillars of strength. But there are such things, including invisible diversities, including mental health, that we really do need to address, because if leaders are not looking after themselves, and everyone is looking to them, there is this huge amount of stress and pressure, responsibility that falls on the shoulders of these leaders to do and say the right thing. And also knowing that very, very small tweaks in communication or the slightest of perhaps the wrong wording can be perceived in quite enormous ways almost. And now, I wonder, when it comes to inclusivity and diversity and inclusion and belonging, which I know that you are all very passionate about, how do you see the role of inclusion at these present times, not only within the industries, and kind of how important do you think people will be perceiving inclusion and or diversity at this moment in time? From just to share very quickly, what I have been hearing is there are two camps, and of course, I would be slightly biased towards one, obviously. One is saying, well, D&I, perhaps those who know less about D&I are saying that it's maybe not at the top of the priority list right now because they're fighting fire and such like. Arguably, the other camp, which I have to say, cards on the table I am with, say there has never been a more important time for inclusivity and certainly embracing humanity and within the broader discipline of that, not just gender, race, LGBTQ+, BAME, mental health, disability, etc., but actually those invisible diversities that sit below the surface that can kind of fester and affect us in our daily lives.
Example about that. So there are, I think, several points that you mentioned here which are really important. One of them is, yes, the gender, ethnicity, etc., age, diversity. When you lead an organization today, you have to make that decisions, right? So I don't know of any company that doesn't have, to an extent, to make tough decisions in terms of, furloughing some staff, sometimes layoffs, sometimes salary cuts. And what my team and I have been really, really struggling with is we went through that exercise of, making lists, and then we take a look at the list, and suddenly somebody says, "Hey, do we have a diversity problem in that list?" And it was actually the case, and it was horrible. So we had to rework the whole thing. And there was no, all decisions had been made on a very logical basis, but still, you end up with this outcome, and you have to pay attention to these things, right? So diversity is going to catch up with you if you don't pay attention, for sure. I mean, in that case, of course, turned out that it was not as bad as we initially thought at first sight. And then we made, of course, a number of corrections. But you got to be very careful. Otherwise, if D&I becomes like a second thought right now and nobody pays attention to it, then you could very easily go back to, go backwards in spite of all the efforts that you've done for years and years to build a culture of diversity and equal representation and all the things that need to be done if you want to make progress, because things do not necessarily happen naturally. You have to force them a little bit and then become more natural. But initially some decisive action has to be taken. So I don't want years and years of efforts to be ruined just because right now we don't even think about D&I.
Indeed, I mean, ultimately, it's a perfect time to innovate, whether you are diverse and inclusive or a company that perhaps hasn't put it at the top of the agenda. In a way, you kind of think, well, if not now, then when? Anyhow, sorry, Helen, I think you were going to say something.
Yes, I was just going to say that I saw a statistic today that 70% of how people feel is influenced by their local manager. So I think that there's a role of us as leaders, as we make sure that our teams are fine and that we check in with our teams, that we actually keep some of these central values in those team discussions. It's not just about the here and now and about the work. It's actually about what sort of culture we want at the end of all of this. And there will be an end to it, or there will be a new normal. And yes, all of those things that we've all been trying to champion for a long time might have taken a bit of time out. It could be the case that in some organizations that there's just been a pause for 6 months on some of the other things while they do firefighting, but those issues will not go away. And in fact, it just puts more pressure on us all at the end of this to be able to redouble efforts, because it means that we're 6 months behind where we wanted to be. But I'd just like to touch on the mental health point, because I think that that's one of those things that we were all talking about before we went into this crisis. And all of us stuck at home are all going through new challenges. And I think just from my own perspective, that we're all talking a little bit more about the way in which we feel. And that I think is important for leaders to show emotional intelligence, but also a little bit of humanity. And bizarrely, because we obviously are all in the same place, we're all sitting in our respective homes, it means you get to see people in your home environment. You know that people are not sitting behind a desk, they might be sitting in their dining room or sitting in their living room. Actually, that there's an element of being normal that I think has come through in this. And I think that's probably a positive thing, is that we all just care a bit more fundamentally about people, because it doesn't matter whether you're the CEO, the chairman, somebody else in the company, we're all struggling with something that is just very different. And we all deal with it in different ways. So that, I think, is going to be one of the takeaways as leaders about how we respond and react to these sorts of situations, how we become more human, and actually how that brings the best out in our teams.
I think that's a really an important point. I think there's a greater awareness of, I guess, the humanity of all of us, and in some cases, the diversity, and again, playing into that whole notion of the kind of the construct of what we've all played into through business schools to actually running organizations, is these kind of hierarchical structures we just fit into. And in some cases we say, well, how did we get here? Well, we climbed the ladder. Well, that we built the bridge. And I really, when I look at some of these moments, I mean, it's quite a, when you look at consumer reports and how millennials and centennials consume, it's largely very different than how we were sold to, and how we manifest our values around privilege and exclusivity. And we wanted, these are the things that, the blue, silver, gold, platinum levels, and all of these types of things of privilege. I think what really matters right now is sincerity and style. And that comes down to identity and belonging, and really has an impact, is that those leaders that their styles and their sincerity can transcend diversity, I think have the greatest, I would say, utility around a situation to be able to move with greater resilience and flexibility, adapt probably to those changes. And I think that that's something, how we, you know, how we document this in terms of case studies moving forward and how that can fundamentally change not just what we do, but how we do it, I think is going to be, you know, wonderful to explore as we go through this, but also at the end of this. But I think sincerity and style are certainly, you know, that's the way of you know, keeping in check with people, you know, and being not self-deprecating, but self-reflective. And, you know, there's some people making, you know, going back to that Maslow's hierarchy, you know, some people that are barely off of level 1, you know, and, you know, in this situation, and for us to be anything less than empathetic and understanding of that in our communication styles, or, you know, is, you know, people are just trying to survive versus self-actualizing on the other extreme. Trying to get people to self-actualize when they're just trying to survive is, you know, and I think we need to, as leaders, need to be really cognizant of the reality that we're facing, and how our character and our personality of embracing equality, diversity, and inclusivity during this time will reflect on our personal brands, but also our corporate brands.
This is so incredibly interesting, everything that you've all said there. I mean, just to pick up on a couple of points, it is very much be gone with the ivory tower, where we're all sitting around, you know, probably with our pajamas on the bottom half and professional tops on the top half, and kids and dogs and whatnot kind of running around. It is difficult not to look at people as people.
They're going to come in the store any moment.
Yeah. the blurred lines between personal and professional, I think, are growing ever closer. But yeah, on the Maslow point, and I mean, it is absolutely, you know, the perfect business case study for those who are examining this period in their business studies degrees and in their various theses. I'm sure we'll look back at this and have an absolute feast on what they could be discussing from businesses that have managed to remain there once the wave has and the tide has gone out, through to those that have unfortunately been swept away with the tide. But ultimately, on the branding point, just finally before we move on, I think it's fascinating now to see those brands that really do care and really are authentic. And I think authentic is a word that probably is overused massively at the moment, but genuine authenticity, the genuine raw emotion, the genuine EI, which ultimately you can't buy, you have to curate, you have to work on, you have to speak about day in, day out with your teams. That is a commodity that is almost invaluable, because when everyone else is being pushed onto almost a level digital playing field, actually, you know, what matters most is how you feel over and above almost how, you know, what people are saying, what people are doing, spreadsheets, the this, that, and the other, the objectives, KPIs that are being kind of pushed onto our computer screens. It is absolutely a emotive piece, and those brands and those businesses that are able to communicate the caring into something that is meaningful and that matters will absolutely, I think, rise above the surface like cream to the top of a milk jar. I wondered, and I did want to talk very briefly actually about our thoughts around business exit and what this may look like. Now, I know we can't predict, but ultimately we are having to put strategies in place. So it'd be great to be able to touch on this, but also, if we can be super brief on this one, I've actually got a plethora of questions for all of you, and we may well have to apologise in advance to our listeners and say, look, we're probably going to be able to only ask each of you one or two of them very quickly. Or in fact, actually, perhaps you could combine thoughts on exit strategy into some of the questions that I will ask, because maybe they will weave in on second thoughts. So, a number of our members and individuals, Helen, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. Firstly, a couple of individuals have said around climate and travel, which of course you are an expert on. Experts have reported the colour of the sky appears bluer, which is obviously positive. Primarily due to, of course, less pollution from the airlines and less traffic. What impact do you see for the future of airline travel? Business, holiday travel to increase or decrease? How will this affect the likes of yourselves at Rolls-Royce, GEC, We can see in the news, obviously, that Airbus has furloughed 3,000 employees, which is terribly sad in Wales this week. And a lot of the airlines, from what we're hearing, have placed significant orders for new engines pre the crisis and due to be delivered. Surely this puts, without putting extra pressure on you right now, but surely it puts a huge amount more pressure now on government relations. And again, I have amalgamated a few questions there because we had many, but in a nutshell, how does that play out?
Okay, right, thank you. I can't comment on the sky being more blue. I think that's probably more to do with some sort of wider astral forces across the whole of the globe. The thing that I'd say is that our society is based on aviation. So aviation is not about us going on holiday to Spain once or twice a year. Aviation is the way in which we live and the way in which we trade. Air freight has continued to fly around the world. And in fact, if you run an air freight company at the moment, you're probably doing okay because lots of people still want that air freight. And so therefore the prices have gone up. But actually quite a lot of global air freight is in the belly cargo of a civil airliner. So when you are going to the States, unbeknownst to you is that sitting in the cargo hold will be some quite valuable products, and those continue to need to be flown around the world. So air freight and belly cargo is absolutely critical, and we're talking here about pharmaceutical products and other high value products that would otherwise take weeks to go in a shipping container. So therefore, unless we're going to restructure the way in which we choose to live and trade, aviation is going to be absolutely critical. I think it's also interesting if you look at the repatriation of people during this crisis, the tens of thousands of people who have been overseas enjoying themselves, exploring new countries, but then obviously need to come back. So there has been actually a kind of a base load of aviation, and that will continue. I do think that there probably are new ways of working that people have adopted. So people obviously using things like Zoom now, but obviously in some cultures, working remotely is not going to be the way in which they want to do business. So I do think that you will see a resumption in business travel, and maybe less so than in the past, but it is going to take quite a bit of time. What I'd say in terms of overall pollution levels in the world, if you look at the contributors to pollution, it's often to do with factories and other industrial processes that are not very efficient, that may be using old ways of manufacture. Actually, the best way to try to reduce the pollution that comes out of aircraft is actually to buy new engines. Of course, I'd say that'll work at Rolls-Royce, but it's genuinely the case. New aircraft, new engines is the way to bring down CO2 and noise and NOx. And that is exactly what lots of airlines have been doing. And I think it would be a real shame if out of this, it meant that they didn't put those orders in, because it means that we're not moving towards greener aviation. So I think it's very easy to ring fence aviation as being a bad polluter. But I think if you look at other forms of transport that we all use every day, actually that there's a lot that we can be doing there. But I think that there's a really positive role for aviation, and we need to remember all of the communities and societies around the world who are heavily dependent on aviation. I don't know whether you recall what happened when there was the volcanic ash cloud problem in 2010, and the rose growers of Kenya were really badly impacted, because that is the way in which to get their product around the world. So we shouldn't just think about aviation through our own eyes, but actually think about the trade and the communities that it sustains.
Absolutely, it is very much part of the wider society. Thank you very much for that insight, Helen. And Pierre, I have a plethora of questions, but I'm going to limit it to 3 here. So firstly, how is COVID impacting the US economy, or the corona economy, as this person has pointed out? Unemployment obviously up by 30 million, highest numbers of deaths globally in the USA, with the New York and its vicinity most affected. Over 70% of all deaths are BAME in specific. And for those who are tuning in, that's Black, Asian, minority, ethnic minorities and individuals. And thoughts around the presidential election. Is it a slam dunk for Trump? Or is he going to be in for another term? And finally, there was a piece about written about your founder and CEO Didier. He wrote in the New Normal, which was fascinating, and I did see it myself actually, around what impact this is going to have for global clients across the board, and not just across the pond from here in the UK.
Yeah, I think, to go back to your first question, the US economy, I mean, one number that is staggering, of course, we don't know what the impact is going to be long term, but there's a good chance that this year the US economy would decline by something like 8 to 10%. Remember that in 2009, the economy contracted by 2.2% in the US. So we're talking about a completely different magnitude, and we have no idea what that means, -8, -10, right? It's absolutely crazy. The federal government's deficit would be in the range of 20% this year, 20%. Remember when everybody was freaking out in Europe about the 3% rule, and some countries, indisciplined countries like Italy, France at the time, drove the Germans crazy because we're at 4, 5. I remember in 2009, we went to sometimes 10% deficit. Now we're talking about 20%. That's absolutely crazy. But it's not just in the US. In China, do you remember that in 2009, the economy did not contract, it grew by 9%. So it was bad for them at the time compared to the usual 13% that they had maybe in 2007. But they were at +9. This year they will be negative probably. So we don't know what that means. I mean, we have to read history books and try to remember what the 30s were, which is not a very good memory for, especially for us Europeans. I mean, for some of us Europeans. So we'll see what it means. I believe that for now, and that maybe goes to your second question about Trump. There will be so much stimulus in the economy that in a way we would be able to mitigate to an extent the amplitude of the whole thing. But it's not because you send every household in the US a check of $1,200, $2,400, maybe $3,000 for families with kids, that the demand shock will be resolved like a miracle. It's a bit more complicated than that. The stimulus packages that I think Helen mentioned are massive, but they're very different from one country to another. In Canada, for instance, they are very much directed to subsidize salaries and make sure that companies are not going to lay people off. The government subsidizes 75% of people's salaries up to a certain limit, right? Which is about, I think, $850 per week, Canadian dollars. But still, it's a massive help to companies. In the US, that's only true for companies of less than 500 employees. So they get loans that are forgiven if they are used to pay salaries. But any large companies or mid-sized company doesn't benefit from any of that. So basically, the government almost encourages companies to restructure with this idea that if they're leaner, when the economy will start to reopen, maybe they will be in a better shape. But the effect of that is that the number of people who are unemployed, and you mentioned that number, 30 million people who actually filed for unemployment in the last 6 weeks, this is 20% of the active workforce at the end of February. So we're talking about mass unemployment, the level of Spain in the worst years, right? About 10, 12 years ago. And I think consumers in the US and people are still confident that things will reopen. I mean, they understand, they're coming to terms with the fact that it's going to take longer, but most people still hope that they will, one way or another, find a way to go through this. Unemployment benefits have been beefed up by the government. They're still low compared to many European standards, but people get something from the state. They've always got that, maybe $300, $400 per week. And the federal state added $600 per week, right? So for people, this is unheard of and feels like, okay, we're better off than we thought, and it's going to last for a while, and then we'll find a job one way or another, and we'll be okay. But I don't know if we will be okay. So you asked this question about Trump. Trump, any incumbent in any election has a big advantage, right? So we know that based on over 100 elections worldwide that we've been monitoring and working on for years, when the incumbent runs and has a 40% approval rate, then his or her likelihood to win exceeds 55%, right? Trump, and it's very impressive, whatever happens, is always very stable, between 40 and 44. So he's more or less, right now at 42, he's more or less at the same level as Obama a few months before his own re-election, right? At the end of his first mandate. So he's not in a bad shape, to be honest. I mean, it's not a great shape, but it's not a bad shape. And he's so disciplined as a marketeer in making sure his base is behind him, that things are not looking too bad. I mean, the one thing that is shifting, and that was not his plan, of course, is that he had always tried to focus the whole debate in the economic society around immigration, around repealing some of the initiatives that the previous administration had taken, like healthcare reform, which in the US is not perceived as a human right, but more as a product, right? So people think, why are we subsidizing people? You should, earn more and then you can buy the healthcare protection that you need. It's a bit weird, right? If you're not born and raised in this country, but that's the way they think, or many people think. Not everybody thinks, but many people think. So what's happening now is that the debate is going to shift completely. Immigration is not a topic anymore anyway. It's been almost banned. And the whole thing will come back to economy and jobs. Right now, people give him credit for trying to reopen the economy, and so trying to fight against the damage done to the job market. And also by increasing unemployment benefits, he looks like he's trying to help people. But the election is in 6 months from now, so I don't know how things will play out. We'll see. By the way, it's going to be a very weird campaign. No meetings. I mean, unless they do it virtually, but that's more like a TV debate. So we'll see. Right now, it's not in a bad place, but it's not a slam dunk.
Very, very interesting. I'm sure lots of people there with lots of opinions, hearing everything that you said there. But absolutely, one thing is for sure, he is an excellent marketeer, and certainly on a positive note, I guess businesses and organisations can certainly learn, about marketing, provided it is, authentic and such. But any further thoughts, Pierre, before we move on to some questions for David?
No, I mean, you were mentioning then the effect on clients. There is no sector of the economy that is unscathed right now. Think of the large tech companies. I mentioned this at the beginning of our call. Initially people thought if you're a large platform in the social media space, if you sell digital products, then you should be fine because people will be at home and use even more digital products. Well, that is true, but you still need to monetize it. Mm-hmm. And nothing can be monetized if you don't have clients, if you don't have people advertising, if you don't have sports. Sports is a massive draw for advertising money. No more sports. So what do you do, right? And then people realize that now. TV shows, yeah, but you need to be able to shoot them. How do you do it? Like from home? I mean, yeah, but it has its limitations as well. Even advertising, you want to shoot a new TV ads, how do you do it? And agencies have been very creative, but again, there's a limitation to that. So if this lockdown lasts longer, and it's going to last long, right? Because even if things are reopened, it's going to be very staged and slow. We will see every single company with its own problems. Nothing is unscathed. And even the governments right now, which are spending, if I look at our own business portfolio, right now our business with governments is booming, of course. Our business with automotive companies is not booming, obviously. So it really depends a lot on the current situation. But long term, even governments with such deficits, how long can they hold that? There's a limitation to it, right? So we'll see. It's going to be difficult. There's less wealth. So we are living in a world where people have less money, less assets, readjust. But like David, I feel it's also a massive opportunity to change leadership style, work differently with people, be more authentic, be more productive. I do agree with Helen that people will resume traveling, and that, of course, our society is based on not just that, but in particular air travel or air transportation. Remember, after 9/11, people were saying nobody's going to take flights anymore. And then I don't know how long it took before we broke a new record in terms of traffic, probably not long. But it was a more isolated event, right? Very, very impactful, of course, but very isolated. So this time it's going to be probably a little bit slower. I would tell you, people ask me all the time, how do you feel? By the way, it makes me feel very good. Our employees, write me and say, how are you feeling? How are you? They seem to care about me, which is nice. The reality is that I got an enormous pressure, like all of us, right? Because leading in this situation is tough, but I travel way less as well. And for my personal health, it's actually quite good. I mean, I'm now realizing how much I was traveling all the time and what kind of a drain it is for your, your personal balance. And I'm not saying I'm not going to travel anymore because I want to, by the way. I'm impatient to resume, but maybe things that we were doing could be now, we realize that we could do things a little bit differently and probably as effectively as before. So things will shift a little bit. But just one last number, 68% of Americans say that they miss their old habits, right? So as soon as they can, they will resume. And by the way, do you know what is the habit that they miss the most and that they want to resume as soon as possible? Going to church.
Very interesting. I've tuned into a couple of online services, actually.
Even before sports, can you believe it? But this is America.
Sports and religion is pretty close.
If you get this, you understand America.
And on that note, I'm going to move to David, because I'm conscious of time. But and I should say, actually, very quickly, lots of compliments for all of you. Number of comments about how impressive all of your backgrounds have been, respectively. But David, a number of positive things, and questions around the wealth of diversity and inclusion and belonging that you have been involved in yourself personally. But from USA and America, disabled sports in the late 90s through to international kind of Paralympic committee at CEO of Glasgow. And I'm sure this is written by a Glaswegian, by the way. But anyhow, the Commonwealth Games in 2014, which obviously a very big success. You must be very, very proud to have taken the role of ops director to then find yourself only within a short period of time rising to that CEO position. The amalgamation of questions and wonderings were around what you learned essentially when it came to federation from Glasgow through to the Games to Gold Coast in 2018 through to obviously being in Australia, and what the key facets were when it came to a D&I perspective. I know you do a lot for kind of women in sport as well, and obviously disability in sport I think is particularly relevant. I see businesses and organisations, I should say more, such as the Rugby League World Cup. I was speaking to their CEO John Dutton the other day, and it's amazing how they've actually managed to integrate all different communities into rugby league and it's actually it's pretty brutal if you watch it on YouTube. My God, it is brutal, but everyone is involved, literally everyone. So your thoughts, David?
Yeah, we are all a reflection of our values and our experiences, which really guide us in our perspectives. And I've been working for 25 years in international sport. I've had the privilege of representing many marginalized groups, and for me, coming from a very, I would say, privileged label in the form of being a white male from the southern United States, recognizing my white male privilege, I have been on this learning curve, I would say, of kind of recovering from that for a long time. And what I mean by recovering from that is that the world is not always through my perspective. And I'm not entitled to have the world move and bounce to my command. And that I've had the privilege of working in about 83 countries. I think working with parasport gave me a real perspective of aspects around how we ultimately value people is reflected on the access we give them and how we treat them. And that can apply to people with disabilities, it can apply to gender, it can apply to orientation, identity, you name it. It's different. But at the same time, if we value people, we give them access and we include them. And so I think the things I've learned through the ages is I've always tried to keep myself in check as I go through, you know, whether it was Glasgow or now Birmingham or Gold Coast or Beijing or Athens or Rio. Yeah, I've had the privilege of working in all these different environments. Are we treating people with respect? Are we giving them access? Are we including them? Are we listening to the voices of affected groups? So the actions that we're taking and the things that we're assuming, are they in fact, what is the impact of those decisions? And that's been something that, you know, is, you know, I usually ask my team, I said, well, have you asked the people that are going to be affected and what did they say? And so I think that first and foremost has been one thing I've learned, is to respect, listen, and learn before I contribute, before I open my mouth. And that is hard because I haven't about everything. So, but I think showing that I respect someone, both in terms of how you approach and how you engage with someone, the environment and the culture you create around you is really important. And so I think in times like these, I'm happy for having had the experiences, both, I would say, you know, the good, the great, well, the good, the great, the bad, the ugly, if you want to put it that way, because it gives me the ability to safeguard and protect others in times like these, but also be very reflective on you know, how I treat people and how I help people adapt to their environment. Because if you treat people as people and you help them with their diversity adapt to an environment, you get the situation. And I think, you know, whether that was Glasgow in terms of being an American, Commonwealth Games in Glasgow in Scotland, right after the financial crisis, in the lead up to the big decision on the Scottish referendum, and a challenging time for the very relevance and notion of the Commonwealth and what that, you know, when I was asking Commonwealth citizens, what does it mean to you to be a Commonwealth citizen? Most Commonwealth citizens looked at me and said, I've never been asked that question, nor have I ever thought of it. So the whole sense of identity and belonging was a real, you know, that's been something I've been able to use as an engagement tool, is getting people to reflect and question their identity and their sense of belonging to what ultimately I'm trying to represent and push forward. And what we've done is essentially, I think what I've learned is that using language that is universally engaging, establishing systems and continuums in terms of your style of communication, but also taking different diverse groups with you on a common journey is really important. So, for example, we have 71 nations and territories that have now backed this strategy, which is called Transformation 2022. And this has been, we've been on a journey for 5 years, and this will lead us into 2022 and just beyond. And we went from an organization that was focused on delivering the Commonwealth Games every 4 years and promoting sport in the Commonwealth, to an organization whose vision now is, through sport, we create peaceful, sustainable, and prosperous communities across the Commonwealth. And, you know, that's really the basis for everything we do now, is how do we ensure peace? Well, we respect, protect, promote human rights, we recognize marginalized groups, we resolve conflict, and we start these awfully challenging journeys of truth and reconciliation. once we establish peace in a community, we can start building the pillars of sustainability. And we can start working on economic, environmental, and social sustainable development. And then we can start to focus on prosperity, which is not just economic prosperity, but it is that sense of communal well-being and fulfillment. And so through the power of sport, we actually don't just look at these big esoteric terms in a vision statement, developed requirements, approaches, narratives, storytelling, and impact assessments that measure all of these elements in terms of the impact of our games and our development programs. So we look at all of that. You know, Glasgow taught me that I needed to not get too far past my post and be accountable for the actions that we set out to achieve, and you know, ultimately at the end of the day, there was a lot of lessons learned, but also a lot of great moments that have, I think, set the Commonwealth sports movement and the Commonwealth up very well to be a relevant player in the world, despite you know, it often being associated with kind of a shared history and more in historical terms.
Thank you very much indeed. And just by way of wrapping up, because I know how busy you all are, and we are coming to the end of the time for today, but thank you all very much indeed for your fascinating insights. And I think what you've left us all with there is a huge amount of food for thought. But very, very quickly, I summarised a couple of the key points. And I think what's very, very interesting is this role of government and industry working together, and the fact that this needs to be and will be a relationship that will become far more open and far more common. But certainly, I think on a positive slant, COVID-19, I hope will be seen by many in business as the start of a potentially successful global pandemic. I know we talk a lot about the challenges, but there are positives there when it comes to innovation and embracing new ideas and new ways of working. I think it's certainly demonstrated the extent of the connections, the connectivity induced by globalization, and perhaps that some value chains and some areas are stretched too thin, but there are organizations that really are embracing green, well-being, business for good, etc., which is excellent. And I think in terms of inventing, I guess, a new global trade model, it will not only be I don't think it will be, I should say, the juxtaposition of national selfish obsessions, but you know, hopefully will emerge you know, from bilateral confrontations. And since the you know, World Trade Organization is now to a degree weakened, all crisis shows that kind of regulated, competed bids and such don't converge on any optimum. Hopefully, you know, we really now are going to be starting to really look at, you know, the sustainable growth for the future, the benefits of technology, be able to overcome these nationalistic fears, start and reinvent, rebuild a safer, open world that is ultimately based around humanity, inclusion, listening, learning, drawing these, you know, kind of, you know, former white ivory towers that existed in the classic hierarchies, but actually, you know, really embracing what is real and what is human, because we are all people at the end of the day. We will have beating hearts and such like. We have families. We want to look after the best of our families and of wider society. So hopefully we can be able to embrace that, and we can start to see light at the end of the tunnel. So thank you all very, very, very much indeed. My name is Layla Mackenzie-Dellis. You've been listening to the DAL Global Virtual Lounge today with 3 absolutely exceptional global leaders. If you want to check us out on demand, or if you want to tune back in and find out any of those key learning points that have been discussed by any of our panelists today, you can visit www.dalglobal.org, and we will look forward to seeing you again very, very soon.